Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Levitsky. I am the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. Dr. Klaas, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to the first in a series of 2 seminars on the crisis in Venezuela entitled Toward a Venezuelan Transition, Escaping a Complex Humanitarian Emergency. I want to thank, first of all, before we begin, our team at Dr. Klaas, in particular, Jimena Codina, for making this event happen. Also to Gabrielle. Thanks to our co-sponsor, the Harvard Growth Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School. And most importantly, thanks to my colleague, Jose Ignacio Hernandez, a law professor at the Andres Bello Catholic University and a fellow at the Growth Lab here at the Kennedy School. Jose Ignacio created, designed, and made this seminar series happen. He will be serving as a co-moderator with me today. As all of you know, I think the Venezuelan situation has evolved over the last 7 or 8 years from a dictatorship and an economic crisis into a full-blown humanitarian crisis, almost without parallel in South American history. The economy contracted more than 60% between 2013 and 2019, a steeper collapse than even that of Weimar Germany. Inflation may have reached 1,000,000%. In many respects, the state itself is beginning to collapse. So Venezuela has become unlivable. More than 5 million Venezuelans have fled the country, an almost unimaginable number to those of us who study the region. And to top it off, of course, we have, over the last year, a terrible pandemic. And yet, to the surprise of many observers, the Maduro government clings to power. And so the humanitarian crisis persists and it deepens. This is a 2-part seminar aimed at thinking about how to escape this unparalleled crisis. The second part, which will feature OAS General Secretary Luis Almagro and Professor Maria Gabriela Ponce, will be next Tuesday at this time at 11 a.m. Today's session will feature 2 terrific speakers. Let me quickly introduce them, and they'll speak in this order. Ricardo Hausmann is Rafik Hariri Professor of the Practice of International Political Economy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is founder and director of the Growth Lab. PhD in economics from Cornell University. He's published widely on a large range of topics, including financial crises, exchange rates, fiscal policy, global finance, and export strategy. Before coming to Harvard, Professor Hausmann served as chief economist at the Inter-American Development Bank, and in a prior life, in a prior regime, he served as Minister of Planning in Venezuela. Secondly, Francisco Cox Vial is a prominent international criminal lawyer. He led the interdisciplinary group of independent experts appointed by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the government of Mexico to investigate the case of 43 missing students in Ayotzinapa, Mexico. He is litigated before the International Criminal Court on multiple occasions. And most recently, he was a member of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, which was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2019. And which issued its final report last year. And it'll be speaking about that mission and its findings. Little bit of housekeeping before we jump in. The event is being recorded, and you can get access to the recording. I think if you register, we will send you a link to the recorded video. Each of the presentations will be around 25 minutes long. That should leave us a good half an hour, at least, for question and answer. The question and answer, you need to submit your question through the Q&A function. And you can do that anytime. You can do it after the talks. You can do it anytime during the talks. And Jose Ignacio and I will take the questions and feed them onto our speakers. So without further ado, again, many thanks for everyone behind this event and to our 2 speakers. And I turn the floor to Ricardo.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you, Jose Ignacio. Let me also start by thanking my Venezuela team at the Growth Lab. It's composed of Miguel Angel Santos, Jose Ignacio Hernandez, Douglas Barrios, Jose Ramon Morales, Frank Musi. And I'm going to be liberally using stuff that they have created. So let me see if I can put well, once again, my screen, share screen, and there we go. And let me see if I'm sharing my screen. One second, now I have to, where the hell is my, there it is. All right, so, and so, and then swap displays. I think now you're seeing, are we okay? Yes, good. All right. So I'm going to tell you a very, very sad story, and I apologize for it. I'm going to give you some of the basic facts, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I interpret the origins of these facts so that we can generate a theory of how to turn the situation around. And I'm going to finish with some dilettante political ideas, because I'm a card-carrying economist, and I know when I'm trespassing, especially with Steve here. So I'll get going. So we've seen people line up to get food. When they get to the end of the line, the stuff is already closed, and when they get in, there's nothing in. So they end up, looking for garbage to eat, and when that's not enough, then they leave. Right. And so this is sort of like the Venezuelan drama. That's the sort of like the real way to capture it. If you want to capture it as an economist, then you would look at things like GDP per capita. And this GDP per capita is down. The latest number is 75% from the 2013 peak, according to the IMF. That means that in 2013, Venezuela was richer than Colombia, say more or less on par with Costa Rica, and now it is poorer than Honduras. Okay, so that's another way of capturing this. This is the amount of calories that a minimum wage buys. If it were to use 100% of the income to buy the cheapest available calorie, which in most of the time was yucca. This is the minimum wage in monthly minimum wage measured at the black market rate. It's now around $3 or so. This is the number of hours you will need to work at the minimum wage. Say to buy a chicken, it's now up to 63 hours. To buy an egg, it's up to 97 hours, and so on. So you can see that you don't feed a family with, you don't feed the worker who has to go to earn this minimum wage, let alone a family. This translates itself into other indicators. We got this data from the private sector. Beverages, sales of beverages are down 90% from 2015, and of basic foodstuffs like mainly cornmeal with which we make arepas, it's down to half its 2015 levels. That has led to this massive migration. These are the 5.2 million people we estimate have migrated using Facebook data. We've seen hyperinflation. This is all of these monetary indicators like the amount of money, the inflation, the exchange rate. Base 100 in January 2013. We're now at, what are these? 13 zeros. So we've added a ton of zeros. This period here, this is a logarithmic scale, so the slope is the inflation rate. So you see there was a big acceleration of inflation until sometime in early 2019. And since then, this is more or less how inflation looks. It went through a period in which it was above 150% per month. Now it's sort of like jumping around between 25% per month and 75% per month. You might say, well, that's more reasonable, but 25% per month is $1,300 a year. 75% per month is $82,000 a year. So just to get, Venezuela is in the many thousands of percent inflation. Now you might say, why the hell are they printing so much money? Well, it generates a revenue for the government. How much revenue does it generate for the government? During the hyperinflation, it was generating about $300 per month, the printing of money. Now it's generating about $75 per month. So this reduction in inflation is associated with this reduction in monetary emissions, but still monetary emissions are above 20% per month, and they barely get them $75 million. All other taxes get them $125 million. So this is a government that is running on $200 million a month, essentially. And it used to be a government that would spend several billion, $8-9 billion a month once upon a time. The financial system used to have over $70 billion in assets. Now it has less than $1 billion. Okay, so hyperinflation has eroded the money. Here you see in the later period, it came from very high levels. All of the money printed by the central bank that caused this hyperinflation is not worth $400 million. All the money in the financial system is not worth $1 billion. It's probably worth $500 million. Okay, so it's really a catastrophe. How extraordinary is this crisis? Well, there's a standard way of measuring crisis. When the thing goes down, you start a clock, then you measure how far did it go down. We call that the peak to trough decline, and how long did it take to recover. So I'm going to go very quickly to ask myself, which are other crises of this magnitude? And this is the global financial crisis. The most affected country was Greece. Peak to trough, it fell 26%. Belgium only fell 2%. This is the Latin American debt crisis. If we call it Latin American, we'll include Trinidad and Tobago, that's the Caribbean, but the worst performer, say, in the continent was Uruguay with 20% decline. This is the collapse of communism. The worst performer was Tajikistan with 71% decline. The Great Depression in the US was 29% decline. The Spanish Civil War was 29% decline. This is the German First World War and Second World War. It was a 40% decline in the first one, 66% decline in the second one. They got out of it out of the Second World War in 11 years. This is France, 52% decline in the Second World War, 41% in the first. These are the two crises in Chile with 16% decline, 73, 76, and 15% in the debt crisis. This is the big Argentina crisis, 18%. Venezuela is 75%. It's bigger than all the crises I've shown you, even Tajikistan, okay? So this just to say, it's so incredibly unique that we don't have a class of similar events to explain it. Now, Tajikistan has a few excuses. We understand, they were part of the Soviet Union. Suddenly they had a bunch of borders that were not there before. They used to have a state. They don't have that state anymore. They have to recreate it from scratch. They didn't have a currency. They have to create a currency. So we can understand a disruption of that kind. But how the hell do you explain a disruption bigger than that in Venezuela? So, by the way, if for some magical reason, the economy starts growing in 2022 and it grows at 10% per year, the crisis would have lasted 21 years. We will get back to 2013 and 2034, and we will have lost over 8 years of GDP, of 2013 GDP. So this is just to say this is a huge, huge event for which we don't have really many historical parallels. Steve mentioned the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was spectacular on inflation. We sort of like matched them, but it wasn't as catastrophic in terms of collapse in output. So this is really something very, very special. So I'm going to give you a synopsis of what causes it. I would say this started from an attack on economic rights. That predates a lot the crisis. It's something that Chavez did starting when he took over, but especially after 2003, where he started, oil price started to go up and so on. So he started expropriating things left and right, controlling things left and right, and that disempowered economic agents. That was exacerbated by the period of high oil prices, where he felt that he didn't need society, that the government could secure enough assets to do what it wanted. And so in 2006, for example, he nationalized banks, telecoms, supermarkets, coffee factories, cement factories, steel factories, 10 million hectares of land. So a very, very generalized process of state control on society. And that actually led to a collapse in manufacturing and agriculture during the oil boom years of 2004, 2014. Actually, the peak in manufacturing and agriculture was somewhere in 2007. So that started declining way back when. And with the collapse in domestic economic activity, I said, well, so there's no more domestic cement, we'll import it. There's no more domestic steel, we'll import it. There's no more food, we'll import it. So they imported a hell of a lot. And as if that was not enough with high oil prices, they borrowed a lot. And they borrowed a lot thinking, we're good for the money because the price of oil is high. That actually led to over-indebtedness by 2013. I won't have time to show you the stuff, but the market stopped financing the regime before the price of oil collapsed. And that caused their first need to sort of like cut down on imports because they could not afford them anymore. And then came the decline in the price of oil in June 2014. That led to an administered collapse in imports. It's not that imports collapsed just because of macro reasons. It's just the government took control of the allocation of foreign exchange before that, and they decided we're not going to allocate foreign exchange for imports, and imports administratively collapsed. And without raw materials, intermediate inputs, spare parts, seeds, fertilizers, and stuff, GDP just collapsed because it didn't have the complementary imported inputs that production required. That led to a collapse in tax revenues, which was also exacerbated by the decline in oil prices. But domestic tax revenues declined by a lot, by something like 50% or so. And that led to the need to print money to finance the government. That led to the hyperinflation, which decimated the financial system and further accentuated the collapse in GDP. So that's my story. I will not show you all the data behind that story because I don't have time. But, a typical question people ask themselves these days is, well, are the sanctions at fault? Is this collapse in Venezuela related to the sanctions? And I want to say, first of all, that the collapse in oil production predates the sanctions, and it's confounded by the fact that in the first sanctions, which were just financial sanctions restricting PDVSA's access to finance, that was not really that important because PDVSA had lost access to finance. The sanctions were in August 2017. In May 2017, PDVSA borrowed from Goldman Sachs in something that were called by some analysts the hunger bonds. In May 2017, it had borrowed at 45% in dollars. Okay, so PDVSA already had no financial access. So those financial sanctions didn't really do much. But then they kicked out the president of PDVSA. They brought in a general from the National Guard. And this guy took 60 managers of the oil company out of their position and into prison. That created havoc in the oil company. So oil production kept on falling. And the real sanctions on restricting companies from buying oil from PDVSA and so on were only imposed in January 2019. So essentially, the collapse predates the sanctions, okay? And secondly, the collapse in imports, the the collapse in imports predates the sanctions. And the collapse in the imports of food and medicine, I'm just showing you here medicine, predate the sanctions. Imports of medicines in 2013 were $93 per capita. They went down to $3.5 per capita in 2018. Okay, so, and that was an administered decision by the state, because it was the state who was authorizing all these imports. But now, interestingly, because the sanctions were sanctions to the state and people who dealt with the state, they forced the government to liberalize the economy. And in January 2019, they unified the exchange rate, liberalized imports, and liberalized prices. That actually led to an import boom financed by the private sector. So actually, if anything, you might say that the sanctions restricted the ability of the state to coerce society. So what does a strategy for recovery look like? Well, I think it has to be based on restoring economic rights, and among them property rights. It's very hard for people to organize production if they're not empowered with some set of minimum rights. I'm going to go in the next slide to tell you a little bit what I have in mind. But that should increase GDP just because agents feel empowered, that they can do things that they were restricted from doing before. But in addition, if we add to the system international finance, that will allow the economy to increase its imports and further increase GDP by buying raw materials, intermediate inputs, spare parts, some replacement capital goods, and so on. The country has been living off of a massive of the depreciation of its inherited stock. It's unable. The private sector is investing something like 2% of GDP, down from 15% of GDP in 2013. That's not enough to just replace the goods that are the capital goods that are being depreciated. That should increase revenues, both because the international finance would go into the government and because a higher GDP would increase tax revenues. That will allow us to end monetary financing of the deficit. That will allow inflation stabilization, the remonetization of the financial system. People would redeposit stuff in the financial system, and that should increase GDP. So an element for recovery has to start with something that might look, some form of empowerment, okay? Empowerment and the reestablishment of a minimum set of property rights, which in the context where everybody has defaulted, it becomes a very messy situation. Jose Ignacio Hernandez led the design of a law, which he called the Omnibus Law, because it's a law that stops in many other laws to change the critical aspects of those laws to create something like a market economy. Second, we need a new oil strategy that will involve the end of the state monopoly on oil. The oil company is bankrupt, it's in default. It cannot do anything because every attempt at doing something will be just trigger its creditors to seize those assets abroad and so on. So that's just a non-viable entity, and it has collapsed. So Jose Ignacio has also worked on the hydrocarbons law, and there's been a lot of work done on new hydrocarbons law, precisely to create the legal framework where people can say, oh, Venezuelan oil is investable again. I'm not thinking that oil is going to be the core of the economy going forward, but given the collapse of oil, just reestablishing oil to its previous levels will require a very different set of rights and legal regimes. We need to restructure the debt. There's just too many people that hold claims on the state, hold claims on PDVSA. We need to clean that up. It will have to go with a massive haircut because the country is so much poorer than it was before. The debt before the oil boom in 2003, the debt was $25 billion. At the end of the oil boom, the debt was $150 billion. It had gone up by a factor of 6 during the oil boom, where the advice of economists would say, put some money apart. So that ballooning of the debt, that means that is now Venezuela is by leaps and bounds the most indebted country in the world. it is the second one. So right now, Venezuela's debt represents something like 15 years of oil, of exports. The next one in line is Sudan, where it represents 4 years of exports. Okay, so it's just the most hyper indebted country in the world. Frank Musi and our team has designed a debt restructuring strategy that would involve a huge haircut on the principal, but some, what they call in the jargon of Wall Street, a value recovery instrument, which is an instrument that would go up if oil production and oil prices recover and so on, so that the old creditors would get some rights on the upside. Okay, that has to be measured so that the bulk of the upside goes to the Venezuelan people so that they can recover from this misery, but part of it would be shared by the old creditors. And in exchange for that, that would clear the property rights around the oil industry so that the oil industry becomes investable again. And this cannot be done with massive international financial support. When I was in the more formally working with the Guaido administration, the number that everybody had in their mind was something on the order of $60 billion. Right now, the situation has only worsened. So, good. So now, I have difficulty in describing this strategy because there is something called the fan belt effect, which is that if your fan belt breaks, and you fix it, then your car runs. But if your fan belt breaks and you don't fix it and you keep on driving your car, the engine heats up, it sees it and melts, and the car, you bring a new fan belt again and the car doesn't go anymore because the crisis has metastasized into other things. For example, there's a collapse of the state. Okay, the state no longer can assure the security of the territory, basic mobility and so on. There's different mafias in different parts of the country under control of different parts of the state. And there's a collapse of public services, electricity, cooking gas, water, gasoline, there's no diesel, etc. So these things, I mean, if it's something that is importable, it's one thing, like gasoline. You can more or less fix it relatively quickly. But other things like electricity, water, even cooking gas, it's a very non-tradable structure. You have to have the capacity to distribute locally and so on. And there's de facto dollarization that is changing the reality of the situation, restricting the choices on exchange rate regimes and so on going forward. So let me now trespass into political things. I would say it's really, really hard to imagine a recovery without regime change. It doesn't mean that, like in Eastern Europe, former communists cannot participate in the government, but they participated in governments that represented a radical change in regime. Okay, so I think that I cannot envision sort of like a recovery within the regime in the same way as Cuba has not recovered, right? I don't see recovery without a mechanism to empower people to do things. You have a state that cannot do its basic things, but it has restricted everybody's ability to do things. Without empowerment of society, I don't see how we can get out of this one. So I don't see a solution without regime change. Now, Venezuela was the fastest growing country in the world between 1920 and 1980. It was incredibly prosperous. By 1980, it was the richest country in Latin America, somewhat comfortably. That it was facilitated by massive immigration from many countries, about 700,000 Europeans from Spain, Italy, Portugal, and elsewhere. And from the rest of the Americas, Colombia, during the dictatorships in the Southern Cone, from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, and so on. So migration played a key role in the past. I think that in the future, migration is unlikely to be strong, but the diaspora, I think, is bound to play a very important role, well beyond remittances. The diaspora is a connection to the world. It's a commercial connection. It's a professional connection. It's an intellectual connection. I think the diaspora can play a really, really important role. The diaspora was, as in the horrible language of statisticians, is positively selected in the sense that it is on average higher skilled than the average population. So it's a very capable, able diaspora, and I think it can do important things. And finally, I want to say that one of the things that I think is problematic for the Venezuelan opposition is that the environment has been so toxic and they have been under so much stress through, imprisonment, exile, and so on. Secret police, moving around and listening to everything that they do and so on, that it hasn't been possible for the opposition to develop mechanisms of internal democracy. And the lack of internal democracy means that there was a time in which there was some democratic decision, say an election in 2010, or an election in a gubernatorial election, I don't know where, in 2010 or 2012 or whatever, an internal a primary in 2012, and whatever was the result then is used to define a distribution of power within the members of the coalition. And that means that there is no market test. There's no sort of like active oversight of civil society on the political leadership. Like, for example, if there was more democracy, the different political parties would present different views and different strategies, and then people would vote, and then the leadership would change according to those preferences, and the leadership would know that they are accountable to the voters and so on. So I honestly think that the lack of internal democracy in the opposition has ended up weakening the opposition, and I think that going forward, this can be a strategy to re-strengthen the opposition, and I think this can be done even under dictatorship through these new technologies that were used in December to vote through smartphones. And I think you don't need to own a smartphone to vote through a smartphone. I think that the technology is there to be able to empower people with voice so that they can decide the course of action of the Venezuelan opposition. I think that would strengthen it, help unify it, and create an agent of change that is sorely missing right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. Great. We now turn to our second speaker. Francisco, you ready?
No, I'm here.
Oh, great.
Ok. Muchas gracias primero por la invitación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for the invitation and to make possible this conversation. Of course, and obviously, I need to thank to the rest of the team of the mission to determine the facts of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, created by the Council of Human Rights. The other two members, one is our President Marta Balinha from Portugal, and the other member, as myself, is Paul Seals, Scottish. And we had a team of about 14 people who really contributed to this work. I just want to clarify, simply because so many things were said about ourselves, that we effectively are not receiving any salary for the work we do, but it's ad honorem. So the three members of the panel are not receiving any sort of payment, salary, and in some social media, they have said that $5 million is what we receive, and that is not true. about mandate, I would like to explain the mandate. The mandate was determined by the Council in this sense that we could determine the existence or not of any uh, of the four specific violations: extrajudiciary executions, torture, forced missing people, and arbitrary imprisonment. These four behaviors were part of our mandate, and the final clause was the one that kicked off our conclusions. In our opinion, having the mandate for that, which is effectively what other missions to determine facts have done, like Myanmar, interpreted alike. So our conclusions could be helpful to bring justice to the victims and to make responsible and accountable the perpetrators. That is why, with that mandate, we have analyzed the facts in light of the international law of human rights, but also the international criminal law, as they could be national or domestic crimes. That said, the methodology used to arrive to our conclusions is a methodology in which we used interview of the victims, gathering documents, interviewing former collaborators, people who were inside of the security forces and in the regime, and some people, in English, they are so-called collaborators or insiders, which are inside of the institutions themselves. That's the methodology we use, interviewing, and of course, open sources and secondary sources who were ratified by the researcher team or the investigating team, in fact. The standard of proof that we use is reasonable motivation to believe. That is the evidence standard that all the independent missions to determine facts have used, and they were created by the Human Rights Council and also before the Council itself. This proof standard is a standard where a reasonable objective person could conclude that it is plausible that the facts have been occurring as we conclude. It's a lower standard that is beyond every reasonable doubt. This mission is not a court, is not to determine eventually criminal responsibilities, but that is the standard, the same standard that is used by the International Criminal Court to rule, and that is the proof standard that we concluded, and we will tell you now. The conclusions are that effectively they were two state policies which contributed, and within them are committing crime against humanity. This state policy is a policy of silencing and to demolish the opposition, and in the combat to crime, they allow and incentivize extrajudiciary executions. Who are the victims of these two policies? From the first policy that is overwhelming the political opposition, these are the people who are notorious through their critique to the President Nicolas Maduro regime. So these people are, and the practice and the methodology or the policy and the way it is implemented is through two organizations, mainly SEBIN and DGCIN. SEBIN is in charge of the intelligence police, and DGCIN is the military intelligence. These two organizations are the ones to implement the first policy that I mentioned. That policy is implemented in the following way. As I explained, we had reasonable motivation to believe that this is the formula to be implemented. They received an instruction. At least one source said that in several occasions, the instruction was directed directly from the President Nicolas Maduro to the director of SVIN in the period of the mandate, so you have clarity, is to 2014 up to 2020. This source, which is a person inside of the institution, tells that to that person it's a fact that the instructions were directly given by Nicolas Maduro to the director of the Intelligence Bolivarian Service, SEBIN. This determines to follow these people. What we say is not that all of them have done it, but some people, determined people, were selected to precisely be followed, and in that process they are followed, communications are intercepted, they follow them, and eventually they are imprisoned without a judiciary order, or sometimes some spurious order that is done by that organization. So it's a fiction to give it legitimacy of legality. That person is taken to the Eliquid and they are tortured. In the process, we were able to realize that there's torture, like being hit, use asphyxia. They are forced to do things. The management of temperature, so that person receives some physical stress, electrical discharges, in some cases, sexual and gender violence, which is obviously within that a torture figure. And there was also a gender approach to see how this crime impacted people, but also how the gender stereotype meant a type of torture that I will explain better in regards to men, especially because of chauvinist approach and that interest of searching how this crime impacted men and women with some gender stereotype. With Sabine, that's the um, way they operate. They're subject to torture, and in the conditions they are imprisoned. Helicoide was a previous mall in Caracas, and these people are detained. In our opinion, we have the reasonable motivation that they are violating the minimum human rights standards in this arrest, and they are subject to torture. Torture is in the first instance of this arrest. They search for information. They are requested to incriminate other people, and that they could self declare their guilt. That will be the objective of the torture, but it's also to denounce other people. And as I said, the other organization that is used is the GESIN. And we see an increase of detentions, and that has been increasing activities of militaries that are against the regime and Maduro president. We expressly said in the report that a government and a state has the right to sanction and to look for some coup d'etat attempts and the crime that effectively is done by the armed forces, but that needs to be with the total respect of the due process, which we realize it does not happen. and there's no way to stop on arbitrarian basis. Torture is not possible, and of course, you cannot cause people to be missed. Degesim mechanics is generally to arrest the people in different places. They are called, for instance, in a place or meeting, there's no warrant, there's no judiciary warrant or subpoenas. They are moved to Caracas, and many times in the uh, intermiddle, they stay in a casa de seguridad, in a security house. In the case of Sabine, family members, lawyers ask by that arrest and they are denied. That's what we, depending on the time, so-called forced missing. In short term, so we make the differentiation of missing people that are forced, that are included in the seventh article of Rome Statutes, demanding the disappearance of a longer term, and that is an imprisonment that is subject to be constituted a crime against humanity if we have the context elements that I could refer later. These mechanics of Degesin, as I said, is being increased in 2017, and the houses of security where they are subject to torture, the people who are arrested, I mean, Degesin arrests military people, but also civil citizens that are related somewhat to some military person that is being searched. That is, of course, to generate either the people uh, giving themselves up or indirect torture to the person that is the object of this investigation. And the torture way is repeated in 7 cases. That's why I'm referring to the stereotypes. There were violations with objects to men in these arrests in the side of Degesin in the standard we set. Reasonable base to believe is not beyond any reasonable doubt. That is the second standard of a criminal trial. These are the two institutions executing this policy in concrete terms. We have seen detentions of people who participated in demonstrations. Then we require more investigation, so you know if the people who was demonstrated were arbitrary or not, because we need more elements to determine if there was no crime commission of these people who were detained. But once they were arrested, these detentions, in the majority of the cases, were arbitrary because of the condition they were arrested. Then there was a policy of torture in regards to the detained people as a sanction. So we believe that there's a policy, and within this overwhelming policy of opposition, there's the possibility of torture that people who are detained are subjected to on these demonstrations that happen in the mandate period. The second policy of the state that we concluded existed with motivation that's reasonable to believe in the combat of crime is execution of people. Just a note on that. We consider in the case of Barlovento, there's a forced missing of people because we have the missing in a long term that people that were subject to process and they're investigated is not all the ones that should be. That is a practice. If we start investigations, if they start investigation, is at lower level and never escalating to the intellectual author or the ones who provided the means so that policy could be executed. So these are the first one. The second policy is the one that through combat to crime is creating extrajudiciary executions. This is implemented by the special forces, which are part of the Venezuelan police, the forces of actions that are special on the Bolivarian police. And there's a facilitation of and deployment of significant resources, and popular neighborhoods are surrounded. And the argument to do that is searching for some criminal that, at least in one case, and has never been detained, and they have been executed in what is supposed to be operations to arrest these people. So the elements to arrive to these conclusions in regards to this second policy is witnesses that declared and had seen that person already arrested without weapons under the police control, and then they appeared dead. These dead people are not allowed to be having access to autopsy. The coffin is not subject to be opened. So we have seen a policy that is significant of state resources to block this and lock this, and they move in official cars. They close and surround the neighborhoods with a clear knowledge. So these are the two policies that use, and these are the crimes we considered have been committed: torture, homicide, that is killing, execution, and this is what we use under Rome Institutes: torture, arbitrary arrest, that is a stop of liberty and actions that are against the human rights, and in one case, the forced missing of people. In regards to the accountability, the criminal accountability of the people that are involved, what we say is that the precise contour of the contribution of these people should be determined by the competent organs, which could be the criminal courts, national criminal courts, but also the courts which have universal jurisdiction. When you are talking of crime against humanity, there are countries in which we have what we call the universal jurisdiction, that is allowing a state, however the crime has been committed in other country, they could trial these cases. If you follow this sort of news, last week there was a rule in Germany. One person that committed torture in Syria, and it was not German and not in regard to German victims, but everything was happening in Syria. But the conviction was in Germany, and these could be implemented in this context, we believe, as we have reasonable motivation to believe that this crime has been committed, and of course it will be receiving the evidence, and of course under the standard of each country in the criminal process, and respecting the due process of the person who are accused, and the standard of each country should surveil. And I think that I want to respect my time now, and I will finish here.
Thank you. Thank you, Francisco. We'll go now for a Q&A session. We had a number of questions regarding the economic situation. I will ask them in English.
one attendee agreed that the sanctions, it looks like the sanctions did not cause the crisis, but wondered to what extent it exacerbated the crisis, meaning what does a counterfactual story look like without the sanctions? Another person asked whether lifting the sanctions would, in your view, actually alleviate misery, and would you modify any of the existing sanctions? Second question, apart from sanctions, had to do with Venezuela's current economic relations, and asked what can or should be done about Venezuela's economic relationships, or economic ties to Russia and to China. The third question had to do with the role of diaspora and diaspora leaders in a post-transition Venezuela, and asked, given the level of polarization and given the level of suffering that those in Venezuela, and also probably propaganda that those living in Venezuela have experienced over the last decade, how much credibility will diaspora leaders have, or do you expect diaspora leaders to have in a post-transition Venezuela? And is that a problem that folks in the diaspora are thinking about? For Francisco, and then I'll let you guys respond. First question of mine, the level of repression that you described reminds anybody who's been studying Latin America for a while of the 1970s. And I guess the question I had is just simply, when is the last time that we saw this level of detention, torture, and disappearance in South America? What is this comparable to? Second one, I'm gonna say in Spanish because it came in Spanish, which is, la pregunta es si el informe de hechos.
If the report on facts presented here, could that be used against the state of Venezuela in case it is taken to court?
On the sanctions, the first part of the question was on counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are, very difficult in science. It's about a parallel universe that you never get to see, so it's very hard to disentangle things. What is obvious is that when the regime had a lot of money, it used it to limit the power of society. So when the price of oil was at 140, they expropriated everything that moved, strengthened the controls, etc., asphyxiated economic activity. So we know from previous examples, say, that the hardening of controls on the economy coincided with higher oil prices, and that now we've seen a liberalization of the economy, in part because they tried to monopolize imports through a military-led company that was doing the imports, and the private sector had to request this company to do these imports, and that allowed for enormous corruptions in importing, overvaluation and over-invoicing and stuff like that. So I would put it to you, it's a hard counterfactual to imagine. We know, for example, that offers of food assistance and medical assistance were rejected by the government. And we know that the government uses its control of food as a form of political control. So all of these things suggest that in a parallel universe, if the government had more resources, they would have privileged guns and tear gas and other mechanisms of state control before they would prioritize food and medicine. So it's not that. That's why I think it's important to realize that the bulk of the collapse more than 100% of the collapse in food and medicine imports happened before the sanctions. Now, what we know is the sanctions are there for a very simple reason, that there is nothing that the government would want from the opposition that they can get in a negotiation, because the opposition doesn't own anything. It doesn't control anything that the government aspires to get. And that means that there is no best alternative. The best alternative to a negotiated agreement is better than anything that can be negotiated, because there's nothing worth negotiating for. And I think that most people who are in favor of negotiations without sanctions are just being completely naive. Sanctions are a road to negotiations. And if you ask me, the most damaging sanctions to this clique are the personal sanctions. And right now, you've seen the massive effort done by the Venezuelan, by the regime diplomats and the Cuban diplomats to get the ECOWAS court to challenge judicial decisions in Cabo Verde, to try to free Alex Saab, which is one of the money launderers of the government, and a person that became, that stole hundreds of millions of dollars in food schemes. So I think that the sanctions are there to make to have something to negotiate for. And in the three instances, well, in the first instance of negotiation with the Vatican, there were no sanctions. But in the two instances, in the Dominican Republic and in Norway, where negotiations have happened, the centerpiece of the negotiation was sanctions removal. So sanctions are the leverage that the international community has to try to effect regime change. Now, with respect to China and Russia, I think these two countries are very different. Russia, I think, is playing more or less the same role that they play in Syria. They provide military support, they provide intelligence support. They don't provide much financial support. If anything, Rosneft has cashed out, and they have been granted, for example, they've been granted free access to the bulk of Venezuela's natural gas resources, but they haven't spent a penny trying to extract a ton of natural gas. So it's just paper rights that they have. China lent to Venezuela something north of $60 billion. It was by far the largest. Venezuela was the biggest destination of Chinese financial allocations, and they've gotten the bulk of that money back. I think the debt now must stand in between 10 and 15 billion dollars left. I think I don't see China providing very significant support to the regime. I would put the support to the regime coming from Cuba, Russia, Iran, and if you want, Turkey and Belarus as the key elements there. And I think that there is a world in which China could play a more constructive role. Vis-a-vis the diaspora, I think such a massive diaspora means that it has very, very, very deep connections to all sections of Venezuelan society. I wouldn't classify political leadership according to whether they're in the diaspora or whether they're at home. Obviously, the ones that are in the diaspora were the ones that were most uncomfortable to the regime and who ended up exiling them or putting them in prison from where they escaped. But my role and I think that it would be a mistake to start dividing Venezuelans, between Venezuelans at home and Venezuelans abroad. And I thought it very, very unconstructive, a piece put out by the International Crisis Group, which I thought was had very interesting data and a horrible set of conclusions from that data. I think that I've worked on diaspora issues in several countries. For example, in Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka went through a civil war, and obviously, the polarization of the country between Tamil and Sinhalese, expresses itself in the diaspora. The diaspora funded the Tamil diaspora funded the insurgency. So that's a more difficult issue. I don't think that, given the composition of the Venezuelan diaspora, that we should think that there's anything inherently difficult politically about being able to unify the political preferences of the Venezuelan diaspora with those of those residing in Venezuela.
Before I pass to Francisco, Ricardo, just a quick follow-up on the point that the no recovery is possible without regime change. I agree. I think that's absolutely right. I don't think the comparison to Eastern Europe is quite the right one, though. I think the best comparison, or the comparison on the minds of the folks in the Maduro government, are China, Vietnam. I think I don't think that this, given a bunch of things, the level of corruption, the level of personal control, the collapse of the state, it will not be possible to successfully follow the Chinese and Vietnamese model. But I think that's what they're going to try to do. It's abundantly clear that the guys running the show now don't give a damn about socialism. And I think that's where they're going to try to go. Okay, sorry to jump in. Francisco, you're up.
Stephen, I'm going to give the most boring response to your question. I have to apologize. I think I can't answer that question because I'm here in my capacity as a member of the fact-finding mission, and we have a very strict mandate. And so I wouldn't want to go out of the mandate and start making comparisons. I'm really sorry, but I think since I'm in the mandate, I have to play my role, I think.
Understand.
Thank you. Si puede nuestro informe servir como fundamento.
If our report can be a base for the Inter-American system, and the Inter-American Court of Law has this concept of the opinio juris that incorporates the opinion of different sources of international law. And one is the universal system of human rights, and our constructions can become a base so as to analyze the situation in Venezuela with the Inter-American Court and also with the Commission. And as I was saying, this is in these points. This report has a double face. On one side, it has a determination on the responsibility of the Venezuelan state, SEBIN, PAES, CICPC, armed forces in Venezuela, the National Guard, and the Bolivarian police are all entities that are part of the Venezuelan state, and the Inter-American system is looking for the responsibility of the state of Venezuela. We know that the agents are the ones that are generating responsibility. And as we see in this report, the system and independence on the judiciary system is at stake here in Venezuela. And there are judges, there are prosecutors that are making efforts to try to issue an order of liberation, to show a bit of a due process, and some judges have tried to investigate files, but they have ended up leaving the country. and it is a great source of responsibility at an international level. So therefore, this report could be a base for that.
Well, by the way, thank you so much. It's quite an honor to be here. We have several questions to Francisco Cox and some questions also to Ricardo Hausmann. Because we are running out of time, I will suggest short answers. I will now switch into Venezuelan. Para Francisco Cox hay 5 preguntas. La
For
primera,
Francisco Cox, we have 5 questions. Maybe Ricardo Hausmann can make a comment here. How the claims on violation against human rights could make transition more complex in Venezuela? The second question is regarding the investigation on the preliminary situation of Venezuela and with the prosecutor's office of the International Court of Justice. Why this hasn't moved forward? What were the reasons why the regime of Nicolas Maduro called for so as to avoid the access of the international mission into Venezuela? What are the next steps? What are the next steps once the September report was presented? And the 5th and last question, how that report could be a base for compensation of the victims of human rights abuse. And for the case of Ricardo Hausmann, we have 4 questions. How Venezuela could avoid falling into this fragility trap after this collapse. And there is a second question that is very interesting in terms of incentive for negotiation. They have asked if the opposition could use as a leverage the control of the assets of Venezuela abroad. And there's another question. What is the mechanism for cooperation to bring together the Venezuelan diaspora and so they could start working for the country? And the last question, what has led the Maduro regime to think about an agreement with the opposition so as to admit humanitarian aid with the PAHO program? Well, how can transition become more complex? Well, this person had a great idea for a doctorate to a paper, because this is transition always in dispute, peace, justice, truth. There is criticism on the International Court of Justice with the peace process. I might have a different opinion. This can generate an incentive to go towards a transition, because people that are called should know that committing these crimes implies a personal cost, and this is not a governmental responsibility. So because most of the times when you're in these systems, you feel that you will have impunity, and but it's not so. But once you have individualized the names, and we have in a database, we have names, so there is an incentive and to go towards a different system. Now, preliminary exam is not final. The prosecutor considered that there were some crimes that they were under her jurisdiction, but they needed to consider the complementarity principle. And this principle means that if the state wants to investigate or not, or if they might not, or are not able to investigate. So the final report of the prosecutor, she says that in Venezuela, there are elements that they might be committing crimes under their jurisdiction. So this is another detailed. This is a preliminary exam, but they're moving forward. Now, the reasons why we're not allowed in, they don't talk to us. They don't answer. We just ask for information. And what we think, well, they do not recognize that we are legitimate. And that's why they allow an office with the High Commissioner and they act with the prosecutor's office, but they do not recognize our legitimacy, even though this is created from the Human Rights Council, which Venezuela is part of. Next steps, last week or 2 weeks ago, we gave an oral update on an update of the report. And in the previous sessions, not 46, but 45th, there was a renewed mandate of the mission for 2 more years with the same mandate that we explained at the beginning. And lastly, if this could be base for compensation, well, I am not an expert in Venezuelan right, but I think that without a doubt, as if the state is responsible, all our systems have a principle of compensation and indemnity for the damage generated by the state for all those individuals that might have been affected by them. Thank you. And I would like to take the opportunity to answer Steve. And this is reform, maybe like China or Vietnam. And we have a state, as in Vietnam, a town and village enterprises with market economy. And that was a country that inherited Maduro. So that's what collapsed in Venezuela, because the state had to meet or comply with certain functions. So those that want to go there, well, we don't know what they might be needing, or if they have to reach an agreement in Moncloa to continue with the regime and to negotiate. Regarding the question of fragility traps,
I totally agree, and that is exactly what I wanted to say when I thought of the metastatic part of the crisis, and mechanically it gets more complicated to be recovered, and that really is bothering me. On that question about incentivizing negotiation, if it is the control on the external assets, totally. Absolutely, Maduro not being recognized, that means he has no control on the state assets that are in other jurisdictions, as in these jurisdictions is not recognized. And that is really complicating an exit without an international negotiation. And I don't see that the state being able to comply with the necessary functions that they need to do it at an international level, especially for a state with the oil resources they have and the oil companies they have, and they need to trade and pay and fund, etc., with the rest of the world. That is to say, also, that apart from this willingness, there's the wish of the international community to see some results, and they are free and responsible against their own parliaments on how they use their power on that jurisdiction in order to achieve changes in Venezuela. And I think it's part of the incentives that are facilitating or possible to be facilitating a negotiation. In regards to the diaspora cooperation, I think that more and more we see ways when you see the collapse of the control of the state and the people use Cele and PayPal to pay in Venezuela. There's ways to for the remittance to the people without the state control. Then I think that part of the ways in which we could help the NGOs in Venezuela, etc., I think there's lots of space for cooperation with the country. What we have been doing in other countries is asking, does this government have a base to facilitate this integration? And one of the problems that the Venezuelan diaspora has is that there's no way to get a Venezuelan passport. I have my passport that is due many years ago, and the lack of a citizen of basic rights is one of the ways to exercise power of the government. If there's a space for cooperation, many things could be done without asking the diaspora to be back. Where the diaspora is could be miraculous in doors to be open and things they could do. So I think, and I continue to think, I don't see a negotiation without the pressure. I see an international community that needs to be protected of negative externalities generated by Venezuela in the terms of the source of refugees and the organized international crime, in terms of the whole toxic environment that has been generated. Like one of the decisions of the one judge in the United States is that Venezuelan government is the instrumentalization of the FARC. So the victims of FARC are due to Venezuelan assets indemnity in the exterior of Venezuela. So outside Venezuela, though, I don't see any coming back without a return of Venezuela to the community of nations. That community of nations demands some return to basic principles of how universal the human rights are and other things that are in the democracy chart of the Americas and other instruments like such. So that's why I don't see, and I think I don't see an exit way without the change in the regime. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, I unfortunately need to close. My apologies to those questions that we did not get to. And I want to thank on behalf of Dr. Klaas and on behalf of the Harvard Growth Lab, Professor Ricardo Hausman, Francisco Cox, and also Jose Ignacio Hernandez. Please join us next week for the second part of this seminar on on escaping Venezuela's humanitarian crisis, which will feature again Luis Almagro. And so that is next Thursday, excuse me, at 11 o'clock. And you can sign up at the Dr. Klaas website. Many, many thanks and stay well.
Thank you.